Welcome back to another episode of our Drift Car Build-Off presented by Spec Clutch and Coil Rad.
It's a very big day here where we show you how to swap the rod bearings on this S54 engine. It's not every day you change bearings in your S54 motor, although it's not an uncommon job with these engines. And after doing a bunch of research and speaking to lots of experts in the field, we decided to use VAC Motorsports kit, which, as you can see, the bearings actually come in a calico box, the VAC part number on there. And the reason they come in this calico coatings box is because that's one of the two suppliers that VAC uses when they designed these bearings. So the bearing itself is actually made by Moly Cleveite, which is one of the most reputable bearing manufacturers in the world. They've been around forever, and they're considered like a tier 1 bearing company. So I should mention though that VAC actually collaborated with Cleveite on the design of these bearings, so they're made to VAC's specifications. And they then go to Calico Coatings for this special coating that they put on the inside of the bearing. It's a Teflon-like material, which has a bunch of unique properties to it, which are beneficial in this application. One of which is heat control or heat reduction. As you know, with like a Teflon frying pan, you can still touch them when you put heat to them, so they're very good heat barrier, which will help protect the bearing should you have a temporary, say, oil starvation issue where you would put a bunch of heat into the bearing. So it'll help protect the bearing in those scenarios. And actually, by being a coating on top of the metal too, they actually act as a physical barrier as well, so they help prevent burning through into the core metal in the bearing. And once you get down into that metal, they wear out very quickly, so they offer a protective layer that way too. And last but not least, the coating also is it's quite soft, and it can actually pick up little bits of debris and prevent scoring of the journal on the crankshaft. So they're actually offering a sort of protective property in that way too. So pretty cool product, and VAC has sold literally thousands of these kits, and from their customer feedback, they know that they've worked very well and that they offer very good longevity. Tony from VAC told us they last at least twice as long as the OE bearings. Maybe much longer than that, depending on what kind of abuse you're putting into the motor. But these should last much longer than OE, which is a bonus because doing this job is not a small thing. You can do it in car though, but in our case we pulled the motor for reasons we've explained before, so it makes it a little bit easier, but you don't want to do this more often than you have to. So we think it's money well spent to go with the VAC kit. And they also use ARP rod bolts. These are ARP 2000 rod bolts. They opt for these rather than the OE bolts for a couple of reasons. One of which is the reusable, where the OE bolts are a single-use bolt. So if you're having to do this job fairly regularly, let's say your car's a race car and you're putting a lot of wear and tear on the motor, you're going to do this more than once. So having a reusable rod bolt is nice. It also just gives you the luxury of checking them and saying, oh, they look good, and retightening them again. So it's nice that they're reusable. And they're also either a torque to angle or torque with an actual torque wrench. Sorry, torque to stretch or torque with an actual torque wrench. So where the OE bolt is torque to angle, and not many people have an angle gauge, and it's difficult to do or to use an angle gauge in car. So being able to use a normal torque wrench or a stretch gauge is much easier in car, or as we'll show you, it's quite easy out of the car.
If you're just joining us and wondering how to remove the oil pan and some of the accessories, skip back a few episodes where we did that. Now, in order to get to the rod bearings, we actually have to remove the oil pump, and that requires removing this 17 mil nut, which is a reverse thread. So what I'm going to do here is actually tighten it, go clockwise as I hold the crank down, and there we go. It is loose. So with it being loose, we're going to remove this and then move on to just slipping the chain off to the side, and then we can take the actual pump off. We are moving on to doing the rod bearings, and the first thing that you're going to want to do is set the crank to bottom dead center, and we've done that already, and you can see we've got cylinders 3 and 4 up in that position. We've actually already done the cylinder number 3, and what you want to do this job is you want to do it in pairs. So 3 and 4 we're going to tackle, and then we're going to do 5 and 2, and then we're going to do 1 and 6, because that way the position of the crank is in the right spot. Now, we've already cracked loose these bolts, but they do require quite a bit of effort. Again, in a previous episode where we inspected the bearings, so I'm going to remove these. And usually you're going to require a little bit of a tap of your dead blow here to get this cap to come off. There we are. In order to remove the bearing, what you want to do is push right in the middle off to the side, and you can see it just rotates like that, and you pop it right out. Now what we're going to do is remove the rod off the crank journal, and that means pushing it down just like so. And you want to get it to a point where you can slide it out the other side there. And as a precaution, what we're going to do is put a piece of cardboard around the crank journal here so we don't scuff it. But now the fun part is reaching down in here and removing that bearing, and it's pretty much the same procedure as you saw with the rod end cap. You want to just grab it, rotate it to one side, and just like that. Now what we want to do is clean the area where our rod bearing is going to go. I just wipe it just like that a couple times over, and just to be safe, I like to blow it out with a little bit of air to get rid of any of the fibers that were on the towel. Now we do the same procedure for our VAC bearing and just clean it on the back side, just like that. Again, a little bit of air, just in case. If you don't got air, you don't really got to worry about that. And now you see this tang. You want to make sure that that tang lines up in the groove there on the rod. And this may be a little bit tricky to see what I'm doing here. I'm going to try to keep my hands out of the way so you guys can get an idea how you slide it in. But I like to line it up on one side where the tang is, and then push the other side down and in. This might take a little bit of fiddling around here, but eventually you'll get it lined up, and then you just push down, and there we are. Got ourselves, our rod bearing is in place there. I just felt it click into that little tang spot. And as you can see, you don't want to have your bearing too high on one side, so you want to level them out with your fingers. Just feel around to see that, to ensure that that's flat, level. And the next thing we're going to do is grab our red line assembly lube and put some down on there, just as so, and spread it out with our finger, just like that. All right, and then next step here is the fun one. We can remove our cardboard off our journal and take the rod and very carefully slide it back up. So you want to be very careful here. You definitely don't want to nick the crank journal, but like that, it comes right back up, and there we go. So now we've got the rod end side done, so we're going to move on to the end cap. Once again, we clean our surfaces. Same thing, wipe this area as well. Blow them both off. And mate the two together. So find my tang. There you go. This is, you'll see much easier now how this works. So I line the tang up on this side and push it down and in. And as I said, you just want to make sure that these ends are level. You don't want something that one side is higher than the other. So again, get the assembly lube out. Get it on there nicely. Spread it out. And put the end cap back on. What you want to ensure is, as you can see, there is writing here that corresponds to what side of the rod that it has to go on. You don't want to mess that up. In order to achieve proper stretch and torque on these bolts, you're going to have to use the fastener assembly that ARP supplies. And not only do you want to put it on the thread as such, you're going to also want to put it on the bolt head area where it's going to mate with the rod. So just as so, coat that nicely to ensure that you're going to have proper smooth torque tension. And now we're going to screw these in. Now what you want to make sure here is not to over tighten the bolts right now. What we're going to do is just get it to a point where it's just starting to feel a little bit of tension, because once we have all of the ARP bolts in place, that's when we're going to go through the torquing sequence. Those ARPs in place, it is now finally time to stretch our bolts into place here. And in order to do that, you are going to need a stretch gauge. This is just a generic one from Lunati. We actually had to modify it a bit down here to clearance the rod and remove a little bit of the spring so that it would fit it for our application here. ARP recommends that we go to 75, between 75 and 80 thou. And I've already marked the position of that on our stretch gauge, which is right around here. So what we're going to do is place my wrench on here. Oop, I should make sure that it goes the right way. Just loosen that a bit. Again, we don't want to see how loose these are right now. So we don't want any type of torque on these. You just want to have them very close to being to that point where you feel just a little bit of resistance. So there's no stretch to them just yet. And then you put this gauge on, and the ARP bolts actually have an area that on the backside that locks them into place. So you know right there we're in place. And I think I've already zeroed this, but I'll do it again just to make sure. Yeah, we are zeroed here. So if you don't, you obviously adjust this. You can see this rotates around. You get it to your 0 point. Make sure you're on. There we go. And now comes the fun part. So I'm going to take a little bit of extra pipe because this does require a little bit of effort. And this is really one of the more accurate ways of doing this versus a torque gauge, but we'll get into that in a moment. I'm now getting to the point where there's good amounts of pressure needed. All right. Where am I here? I gotta make sure. So I think, wow, that is it right there. So that is 75 thou. And there you have it. It's really not that difficult of a process. So we're going to repeat this on the rest of them and we'll be good to go.
Before we torque down the rest of the rod bolts, we thought we'd have a quick discussion with you about this method because it's new to us. And we should mention that we had a long conversation with Tony from VAC Motorsports, who's been building these engines for a very long time. And his preferred method is the stretch method, and it's also ARP's preferred method. They even say on their instructions here that use the stretch method, and if you can't, then you can default to using a torque wrench. And in this case, the torque spec would be 70 foot-pounds. In fact, Tony from VSE told us the exact same thing. He said, best to use the stretch method if you can because of this repeatability issue of taking the gauge on and off to torque it. But he did also say that it's perfectly fine to torque it with a torque wrench to 70 foot-pounds, and in a lot of cases you have to do that if you're doing this job in car because there simply isn't room to get a stretch gauge or, in the case of an OE rod bolt, an angle gauge in there. So I wouldn't be afraid to use the torque wrench for this job, but we figured the stretch gauge is more accurate. We have the room to use it here. Let's just default to that method. I also wanted to mention another point that Tony from VAC brought up to us, and that is when you're checking your rod bearings for wear, we initially checked just the bottom side, but then when we checked the top side was completely nuked. The whole middle of the bearing, the coating is completely worn off, and you can start to see some copper underneath showing through. So, and in fact, we noticed that with all of our rod bearings, the top side were a lot more worn than the bottom side, which apparently is pretty typical on these motors. So when doing that initial inspection, it's definitely worth checking the top side. It's more diagnostic than the bottom side. So little note, correction to our original methodology. That is a wrap on this rod bearing installation experiment of ours. We hope you found it useful, informative, maybe a little bit terrifying, because I know I did. But I should say thank you very much to Tony at VAC Motorsports, who spent a good hour or so on the phone with us, educating us about this whole process and kind of setting our mind at ease about doing the job ourselves. So I should also mention that all we've got left to do is oil pump and oil pan, but we're not going to show you that because it's pretty basic stuff. But I will mention that we're going to use the OE gasket, which is apparently the go-to solution for this. It seals better than any of the aftermarket options. So for OE parts, we've gone to our friends at Bud's BMW in Oakville, Ontario. We'll get to that in a minute. And I should also mention that if you're looking for an affordable stretch gauge, this Lunati one that Moose picked up did a good job. Once we tuned it up a little to make it fit properly and spent some time kind of like figuring it all out, I think it worked quite well for us. So if you're looking for an affordable one, this was like 60 bucks, I think. We'll put a link in the description to that. So thanks again, everyone, for watching. Really appreciate all the support. We need some support when we're working on these fancy motors that we're learning with you guys all about. So, and if you want any Speed Academy swag, you know the deal. Jump onto speedacademy.shop. We'll see you next time when we put a clutch and flywheel on this and get this puppy back in the car.